Professor Rose Luke is a transport economist at the University of Johannesburg, joining us now live to discuss the impact of this ongoing truck drivers' protest. And in light of what happened earlier today, we'll also get her thoughts on this. Professor Luke, good afternoon. Welcome to Today here on eNCA DSTV channel 403. Just overall, I'm not sure if you were able to hear what the various ministers had to say, including the Minister of Employment and Labour, Minister of Transport, Minister of Home Affairs, and the Minister of Police in their briefing following the consultations with the trucking industry. But it looks like people are coming around the table, maybe finally to find a sustainable solution, because if they don't, the impact on the economy is going to be pretty negative.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that one cannot possibly underestimate exactly how much of an impact it will actually have. If we start to think about all these goods which are destined for our overseas markets, I mean, surely from a customer perspective, we must have enormous stock shortages or stockouts. And even though one thinks that 24 hours is not necessarily a major effect, but we should always bear in mind that the tracking system is part of a broader global logistics or supply chain system. And trucks connect with ships, and if a ship is missed, for example, it is likely to be days, sometimes even weeks, before a new slot is found. So stockouts are likely to be quite significant. And customers may in the short term rely on things like safety stock, but they may also be looking for temporary alternatives. And of course, if supply remains unreliable, it makes sense then for customers to start to consider using alternative suppliers in the long term. So even though customers may not like these choices and they may not be practical, but there's always alternatives for them. And if the customer always has alternatives, it also means that they may think of losing us as suppliers in the long term simply because we're unreliable, which means that we're then a high cost to them. So I think that for South African exporters, it becomes a major issue. They lose money on the shipment. Potentially, they have to pay to expedite the shipment. In the longer term, their customer relationships are damaged. Their reputational damage is severe. They could lose the customers and they could drop the businesses.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at these drops in businesses, this means less employment, less overall effect in such industries as the trucking business. So the impact is vast, not just for businesses, but also for government.
And then small businesses become the hardest hit as well. I saw a statement last week about the amount of money that could possibly having been lost to the economy last week, about 300 million. That was a warning that came from the industry in terms of trade and small business getting affected. And some of the alternatives might actually mean moving elsewhere. This is very anecdotal, but I crossed the border to Mozambique 2 weekends ago, and the queue of trucks was longer than I'd seen, unless it's during the peak periods of the year, like ahead of Christmas. But this is like middle of the year. But there were many more than in the past. And I gathered that since the July riots that affected, for example, the Durban Harbour, and also recently with the blockade, some customers that you mentioned are already looking for alternative harbours.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that what we need to recognize is that this corridor that is mostly affected, it affects companies from Zimbabwe, from Zambia, as far afield as DRC, who are all exporting through Durban Port. So what we could look at there is that people are seeking alternatives, some of them being in Namibia, some of them in Mozambique. And as things develop, you can also look at Angola, Tanzania, etc., as alternatives for them. And this is not unreasonable to think about. And Mozambique themselves and Namibia themselves have recognized this as an opportunity. And although it's taking its time, but they are also developing great port capacities to rival ours. So these are things that we have to consider going into the future, is that there are many alternatives, and over time they will develop and become viable alternatives. So we really have to keep an eye on these things in order to make sure our economy thrives.
So the efforts today by the ministers, as we've seen with the various stakeholders, should be a welcome move. But of course, the implementation of whatever is being agreed to resolve this issue around the employment, legal or otherwise, of foreign truck drivers.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is something where we really have to look at trucking companies, especially aberrant trucking companies, government, and all the stakeholders coming to the table to discuss it, because ultimately we have to think about the so-called South Africa Incorporated and what works best for our society and what works best for our economy. So we really do need to put viable long-term solutions on the table, because the alternative is too bad to think about.
Thank you very much. Professor Rose Luke, a transport economist from the University of Johannesburg.